In this video, we're going to talk about the basics of configuring jobs and retention policies in Archive Manager Files Edition. We're going to start by taking a look at our Scheduler tab in Enterprise Manager where all of the job creation happens. You'll see we've got several jobs already set up, but for the purposes of learning how to do this, we're going to create a new one. So I'll just click on Create, and I'll type example job. And we'll take a look at the job types here. Now we're going to start with the archive job, which is your basic job. It runs through your file system, decides what needs to be archived based on the instructions that's been given under retention, filters, and that type of piece. We're going to go and take a look at the other types. So we've got delete jobs. Your delete job will go through and look at your file system, find anything that's been marked for deletion by the archive system, and will purge that document. So we've got a direct archive job. The direct archive job monitors the system and archives any file or document that's been modified automatically once it's been retrieved, modified, and put back. We've got our archive forecast job. Now this is an interesting one. The archive forecast job is exactly like an archive job, except what it does is run through your file system, make a note of what would be archived were it a real archive job. And rather than do anything or take any actions in the system, it will generate a report. And I'll just cancel out of this real quick and show you what that looks like. Over here in the Reports tab on the bottom, the archive forecast job will leave a report with you with a summary of items that have passed through the system but haven't actually done anything. So this is a good resource to run an archive job, find out what the archive job will do once you run it, and get an idea of what that will look like in the end. So I'm just going to pop back to the Jobs tab, go back to our Create page here. And again, example job. And we'll take a look at our last couple of job types. A synchronization job will take a look at your file system, make sure there aren't any changes that have happened in the file system but not in the archive system, and synchronize those changes so when you're looking at the file system in Enterprise Manager, you're seeing an accurate representation of what the file system looks like on your file server. Your shortcut creator pertains directly to something we call delayed shortcuts, which is a feature where you can mark a file or a series of files to when they are archived rather than have an archive shortcut put in place right away. It'll delay the creation of that archive shortcut, leave the original file, and say 30 days later, flip over that piece into a shortcut. This is the job that goes along and makes that action. So in this case, for example job, we're going to make it just a standard archive job. And we'll hit OK, and you will notice that our example job appears in the job list here on the left. We can click on that and we'll get our list of properties down below. Now for an archive job, we've got our number of threads, by default set to 4. That's pretty standard for a modern server. You can increase it or decrease it depending on the performance level of your server. Of course, increasing it will give you a bit bigger archive performance, but will tax the actual hardware on your system. Lowering it would be the opposite. Shortcut type, by default, normally we're going to leave it on default. There are a few rare situations where you're going to want to switch it to FSA or HTML, but in order to get more, I don't want to get that deep into it. In order to get more information on those, you can contact us or get into the manuals and take a look. Enabled is important. Oftentimes people will create their job, leave it in the system, and walk away. By default, the system will leave a new job as falls for enabled, which means that it's just sitting in the background. It's not going to run. We don't want it to kick off unless you specify that it's going to kick off. So you typically want to switch it over to true when you want it to be able to go. Now it will run at its scheduled time. Job name and job type, we lock those in creation. Email notification. So it will automatically send you an email summary of what happened with the job every time the job runs, should you choose. And you can choose whether you want that to be a basic summary or whether you want the email report to have more detail. You can actually set this in our settings tab under notification. This is where you're going to be able to enable it at a master level, tell it when it can send that and what email address, etc. you can use to send those reports. Okay, so we want to go back to our example job here in our scheduler list, and we're going to take a look at the rest of the properties here. So we move on to retention category. This is obviously an important one. Your retention category is something you assign to a job that's built outside, and we're going to look at that in a minute. But your retention category is going to decide when your file's archived, how long it stays in the system, whether that be compliance or for storage reasons. It's also going to decide whether or not the file is moved into a particular HSM folder. You could have multiple HSM folders in an archive manager system, and the retention category will decide where to put that file in the archive. So we've got our scheduling settings. We decide when we want the job to start. This is the day that the job should start, whether that be now or I want it to start in 2 months. What day we want it to end. Let's say we want it to end 2 years from now and just stop running. We don't want it to only run for a month and then stop. This is where we mark that. The run interval, so right now we've got it set to every day. So every day at whatever time it's set, here's 7:02 in this case, it's going to kick off and run from the beginning. So that's where maximum runtime comes into play. We can set the maximum runtime to actually be 4 hours. So it will only be allowed to run for 4 hours. Then it's going to automatically stop itself. Typically, we like to set that to infinite because it'll keep running until the next run interval. That gives it the most chance to get its job completely done. Now, let me move on to folders. So obviously, this is an important section. We decide what folder we want the system to actually archive. Let's take a look at data. We've got our product documents. Let's say we want to archive product documents, and let's say we want to archive home drive. We can click those off. You'll notice that the check mark is gray, and what that means is we've only clicked off the folder. So we want to actually expand that, and if you expand it, you'll notice that checking off the folder doesn't check off everything underneath it. It just denotes that home folder. So if we want subfolders to actually be included, we click again until the gray disappears. It will check off everything in every subfolder under the main folder. If we have specific subfolders we want to go with, obviously we can uncheck those. You'll see this goes gray again to denote that not all the subfolders are being archived, and we can go with that. We can switch out to any folder we want, add them all in. This is what this archive job is going to look at in terms of the folders in the file system. Now we've got available filters here on the right hand side. Filters can be managed and created in the filters tab down below, and a typical filter will allow you to do something like, in this case, it will specifically filter out only files that have been modified in the past 2 years. It will ignore any other file. In this case, they've been last accessed in the past 5 years, created 90 days within the last 90 days. You can create these and play with them here. You can set wildcard filters so it'll only look at particular folder names, particular file names. Once you create a filter, it's going to show up back in your Jobs tab. And when you want a filter to be applied to a particular spot, in this case, you're always going to want to set it on a folder level. So I'm going to go to my Archive Files drive. I'm going to choose this. And I'm going to see that we have these available filters for this folder. So let's say I want to do last modified in the last 2 years. I'll click here and make sure you press apply, because often people won't just walk away from that. You need to press apply to have it actually go into place on that folder. And you can filter as many folders as you want, as many places as you want, and the archive job will respect that filter when it goes over that folder. So now we want to talk about retention policies. So we'll flip to our settings tab and to our general tab down at the bottom, and we'll see our retention categories. Right now we have a default retention category in place. We've got our list of options here, but for the purposes of learning how to do this, we're going to create a new one, and we'll call it our example retention. Okay, you can add a description. Retention policies are things you'll work with over years and years. It's often a good idea to add a description in order to remember what you set that particular retention policy for. Target schema, this will list all of your HSM stores, and most people will typically only have one. There are several cases where you'll have multiple HSM stores. This will decide where, when something is archived, it's going to be placed in which HSM store. In this case, we're just going to leave it at the one file. So our retention time, obviously this is the core purpose of the retention policy. How long is this archive piece going to stay in the archive? You've got a couple of options. Default's fixed 3 months, so this means from the time of archiving, in this case, and we can select that. So this is 3 months after being archived. We can also decide whether we want 3 months after the file was created or 3 months after the last time it was modified. Now, this is going to be locked in once we create this retention, so you got to be really sure about what you want. In this case, we're going to leave it 3 months after the date it was archived. For those 3 months, the file in the archive can't be deleted. It has to be staying in place. It can't be moved. It can't be touched. It's locked down. We can also decide to leave it infinitely with an infinite job. This means that any archive file is permanently in the archive and there's no easy way to delete it. It's locked in. So be very careful when you choose this, because you are adding more and more files to your HSM store, and you'll have a lot of trouble getting in there. You need a lot of room to actually leave it on infinite and keep all your files forever. That's where the indefinite job comes in. So the indefinite job acts similar to an infinite job, except it gives an admin, an archive admin, the ability to go in and essentially turn off the infinite job and set the policy back to a fixed one. So an item that you originally intended to keep forever can be put back into a fixed retention time, and it can be set to be deleted later on. So keep alive time. Keep alive time will allow the system to lock in a specific amount of time after its retention policy is over that the file will stay alive. So in this case, if you had a fixed 3 months retention and a keep alive time of 3 days, it means after the retention policy is complete, it will keep that file alive for 3 days, and it cannot be deleted. It won't be marked for deletion rather, or purged by the system for those 3 days. Enable document expiration, kind of similar, but the other way. We can actually say, in this case, we want, after 3 days, so the retention time's over, 3 days later, we want it to be eliminated from the system. Retention time being over, say a file that's 3 months, has a retention time of 3 months, it's not automatically marked for delete after its retention time is up. It just means it can be deleted. So in this case, document expiration allows the system to come along and say, this file's past its retention time, it's 3 days after its retention time at least, so we can mark this for deletion. And limit number of archive versions. The file archiver will go in and keep new versions of documents as they're modified and changed. If you have a file that's very often modified, sometimes you can end up with a lot of versions. This limits the number of versions the archive system will keep. Okay, so shortcuts. This is the other piece that the retention category controls that's quite important. We've got several options here on how to handle archive shortcuts on this particular retention policy. So keep the original document. This is essentially, there are no shortcuts in the system. When the archive job encounters a file that it needs to archive, it leaves the original behind and makes an archive copy, and the two remain separate. Delete the original document. This is the opposite. So the archive job comes along, finds a file it needs to archive, archives the file into the archive, and deletes the original off the file system. So only the archives exist, but nothing in the file system, no shortcuts. Create shortcut. So this is where we get into putting shortcuts into place. We've got options within creating a shortcut, what the system will do when it encounters a file that it needs to archive. Create shortcut immediately. This is by far the most common option. So it archives a file, it leaves a shortcut behind. Delay shortcut creation by several days. We talked about this a bit in jobs. So let's say we wanted this to be 30 days. We're going to go in and the archive system will encounter the file it needs to archive, leave it in place as if it were on keep original document. 30 days later, it'll flip that original document into a shortcut. And again, it's the shortcut creator job that does this. So that needs to be running in order to enact this properly. So create a shortcut if the document was not used for at least a certain amount of time. So let's say we wanted, a file that wasn't used in the past 8 hours. We want that to be archived. 8 hours. We want that to be archived, but if it has been used consistently in the past 8 hours, just leave it alone. Make the archive, but don't create a shortcut. Just leave the original in place, and we'll do that. We have post-handling of shortcuts here. Do we want to keep the shortcut forever? This will create the shortcut and leave it alone. It could be manually deleted by someone in the file system. That's fine, but the archive system itself will leave it alone. Or we can put a mark on it that says delete the shortcut after 1 day. So let's say every shortcut that's put in place, after 1 day, the shortcut is removed. Now the original file is saved safely in the archive, but that shortcut in the file system will automatically be deleted. Okay. We'll hit next. Set the retention category to default. This just means that when you create a new job, it will be the job the retention category that automatically pops up in that job to be used. Enable automatic deletion of unreferenced documents has to do with the synchronization job automatically deleting files that are marked for deletion rather than the delete job. Most of the time we're going to leave this one alone. you have more questions about it, you can ask us, but for the most part, you're just going to want to leave that one. Okay, we'll hit finish, and our retention policy will show up. We've got all of our options here. We can change it, we can delete it, and you'll also see if we flip back to the archive tab, or the scheduler tab rather, go back to our jobs, that retention policy we just created is now available, and we can apply that to a specific job. And that's the basics of creating, configuring a job and retention policies in Archive Manager Files Edition.